Story 1. Thanks for the ride. After 2 weeks on a distant job site, the excitement of reuniting with my family was the only thing on my mind. My wife's smile and the sound of my children's laughter were calling me home. Although I'd left the site later than planned and night had already set in, the long 4-hour drive was just a final hurdle. As I was heading down the road, that annoying little light popped up on my dashboard indicating to me that I wasn't going to make it home if I didn't stop for gas. I pulled into an isolated gas station, hoping to refuel, grab a quick snack, and head back out on the road. After filling up, I walked inside, grabbed a bite to eat, and settled in the seating area for a quick moment of rest. As I sat down, I noticed a man. He was sitting at the table across from me with a small bag, nursing a cup of coffee that looked like it had been sitting out for hours. He was staring at the TV, but didn't seem to be watching it. His clothes were slightly disheveled, as if he'd been wearing them for more than a day. I made a comment about the talk show host's latest joke, and his head turned toward me. His eyes lit up, and he chuckled. "You watch this guy too?" he asked. His voice was friendly, with a hint of a southern drawl that felt familiar. We started talking, first about the show, then about where we were from. Turned out, we had both grown up in the same area, only a few towns apart. "Small world," I said, and he agreed, his face breaking into a wide grin. In a very short time, we shared stories about hunting and fishing, about the one that got away, and the best spots no one else knew about. It felt good to talk about something other than work for the first time in weeks. We had the same favorite football team we discovered, and we were both die-hard fans. "I never miss a game," he claimed, and we dissected last season's plays with the expertise of coaches rather than fans. It was comforting, finding common ground with a stranger in the dead of night. "What brings you out this way this late?" I asked. The question seemed to pull the man back into a thought that he had been avoiding. After a brief moment of hesitation, he began to detail a story about an argument with his wife. He spoke with a mix of frustration and regret, his hands fidgeting with a napkin as he recounted the impromptu walk that led him here. "I just needed some air, you know," he said, looking up at me with eyes that were searching for understanding. He talked about trying to get out to his brother's house, a destination not too far off my route. "I don't want to call him," the man said. "This isn't the first time this has happened, so I don't want to bug him." I understood, and I felt for the man. Maybe it was the hour, or the shared histories that fooled me into a sense of camaraderie with him. Whatever it was, I did something that I don't normally do, and offered the man a ride. With a look of relief and gratefulness, he nodded and agreed. He grabbed his bag and we both made our way out the door. The moment we merged onto the road, the cab of my truck filled with a silence that felt like a dense fog. The man's easy smile had vanished, as if it had been a mask that he'd discarded. His gaze, which had been warm and engaging, now seemed cold and calculating, darting around the interior of my vehicle, taking in every detail. He leaned back in his seat, his body language closed off, where before he had leaned forward, engaged and open. His questions started innocently enough. "Nice truck. How long have you had it?" But they quickly turned probing. "Your wife must like it. Does she drive it often?" he asked, his voice a low drawl that seemed to carry an edge I hadn't noticed before. I gave a non-committal answer, trying to keep the conversation light, but the man pressed on. "What about your kids? I bet they love riding in this beast," he continued, his eyes now fixed on me rather than the road ahead. It was then that I felt the first real stirrings of discomfort, a prickly sense that something wasn't right. I tried to redirect the conversation back to neutral topics, but he was uninterested in small talk now. His questions grew more invasive, asking not just about my family's habits, but also about specific details like where my wife worked, the schools my kids attended, and even our holiday plans. Every question pricked at me, signaling that the interrogation was driven by something deeper than just simple curiosity. My attempts to change the subject were met with a stony silence that hung heavy between us. When I mentioned the favorite football team we had talked about earlier, hoping to revive the friendly banter from the gas station, he brushed it off with a disinterested grunt, contradicting his earlier enthusiasm. It was a jarring inconsistency that made my skin crawl. He kept fidgeting with his bag, too, looking down at it as if he were trying to calculate just the right moment to open it up. It made me nervous beyond belief. Realizing my mistake, I felt the walls of the truck close in on me. I had to get this man out of my vehicle, but how? I couldn't just stop and demand he leave. The tension was thick enough to cut, and I had no idea how he would react to confrontation. Not knowing what else to do, I lied. I pretended to check my phone, like I'd gotten a message. "Damn," I said out loud. "Just got a message. Looks like I'm going to have to take a different route." I left it at that, hoping to not have to go into too much detail with the risk of my lie unraveling. My voice was steady, but inside my pulse was racing. His reaction was unnervingly calm, almost as if he had expected it, or worse, as if it didn't matter at all. When we reached the next gas station, he exited my truck slowly, deliberately. There was something in his movements that chilled me, a calmness that didn't match the situation. As he was about to close the door, he looked back at me, his eyes piercing straight through me. "Thanks for the ride," he said, and with that, he closed the door and began to make his way into the station. As I drove away, the relief of his absence was tainted by confusion and fear. The encounter was over, but the sense of unease clung to me. What in the hell just happened? I thought to myself. Trying to put the encounter behind me, I continued driving down the road. When I checked my rearview mirror, though, in an instant, terror like I've never felt before in my life cut straight through me like a hot knife through butter. There, in the reflection, as clear as anything I'd ever seen in my life, was the face of the man, eyes wide, staring straight into mine from the back seat with the most sinister look I'd ever seen in my life. In a panic, I swerved. The tires squealed. My gaze darted back and forth from the mirror to the road, to the back seat. I started screaming and slammed on the brakes and cut my truck as hard as I could to the right onto the shoulder. I slammed the vehicle into park and flew out the door, stumbling into the road. I picked myself up and began yelling at the man to, "Get out of the truck! Get out!" My mind was a whirlwind. I watched him walk into that station. How in the hell did he get into the back seat of my truck? I continued to yell, but there was no response. Not knowing what else to do, I finally mustered up the courage and slowly walked to the back door and flung it open. There was nothing. Nobody. On top of that, my back seat was filled with tools and gear. There wasn't any room for anyone to sit back there even if they wanted to. Shaking with a terror I'd never known, I stood by the side of the road. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. I know what I saw. It was as clear as day. After some time, I gathered every ounce of courage I had left and climbed back into the truck. I continued down the road, constantly checking my mirror just in case. A few miles ahead, I pulled into a 24-hour diner. I walked in, a nervous wreck. So many questions rolled through my mind. Had I imagined what I just saw? Who was that guy really? How was it possible that I saw his face so clearly in my rearview mirror? I texted my wife, keeping it short and telling her that I'd run into some delays but was fine and would be home late. I then ordered a cup of coffee and sat there for hours, not daring to leave until daylight broke. At first light, the rising sun's warmth did nothing to alleviate the chill of the night's events that clung to me. Again, I made my way down the road. Each mile felt like a small victory. As I rolled into my driveway, the familiar sight of my house finally offered some relief. As I entered, my wife's worried frown melted into relief at the sight of me. "You're late," she said. "Where have you been?" My kids, blissfully ignorant of the night's terrors, charged towards me, their laughter a comfort to my frayed nerves. "I'm sorry," I muttered. "Ran into some car trouble." It wasn't entirely untrue. The car trouble had been the catalyst, but the real trouble was something I intended to carry on my own. Time passed, but the memory of that night lingered, refusing to fade into obscurity. It stood apart from anything else I'd ever experienced, a jarring episode that seemed to defy logic. I made a promise to myself. Never again would I extend an invitation to a stranger, ever. Any ideas of doing such would be left, along with the mysterious man, in my rearview mirror. Story 2. Gone in a Flash. It was late, past midnight, and I was coming down the mountain after a long day. I'd been working heavy machinery in the forest, and it was grueling work, the kind of work that leaves your bones feeling like they've been ground down to dust. I was anxious to get home and get some rest and relaxation for a few days before getting back at it. Those back roads can be dark and lonely, but I'd made the drive 100 times before and didn't expect this one to be any different, but it was. The roads coming out of the mountains, as anyone would expect, are full of dips and sharp turns. If you're prone to motion sickness, it's definitely not a drive you'd want to have to make. You're typically the only one on the road for miles, and only on rare occasions would you be blessed with a short straightaway long enough to max out at 40 miles per hour. It was on one of these straightaways that something strange happened, something terrifying, something that I've not been able to explain to this day. It was the second straightaway off the mountain, a good third of a mile stretch before having to slow down to cut a sharp turn to the right. The stretch had towering trees on both sides and a sharp drop off to the right. It wasn't a place where you'd want to wander off the road. Doing so would ensure that it might be days or weeks before anyone found you, and by that time, well, you probably wouldn't make it. I hit the stretch and accelerated to about 40 miles per hour, something I'd done countless times. As I was about to slow, preparing for the sharp right turn, a blinding light materialized out of nowhere. That's the best way I could describe it. It materialized. 1 second it wasn't there, and then the next second it was directly in front of me in the center of my lane. The light appeared to be in an oval shape. It was probably about twice as tall as it was wide. If I had to guess, I would say that it was probably 7.5 to 8 feet tall. As strange as all that sounds, that's not even the strangest part. In the center of this light was a blurry silhouette. The edges of it were not well defined, but overall, it took on the form of something that I guess I could describe as human in form. I could see a head, no visible neck, but there were shoulders and long arms connected to a large torso. The lower part was hidden, lost in the bright light that enveloped the base. In an instant, the light and its accompanying silhouette were in front of me. It materialized so closely and so quickly that I barely had time to react. I slammed on my brakes, and as my tires squealed loudly into the dark night, I cut my truck to the left as quickly as I could. It wasn't quick enough. A tremendous crash erupted, a noise so thunderous it felt as if it originated within my own skull. This was immediately succeeded by a shriek that defied identification, neither entirely human nor animal, but an agonized and chilling sound that fell somewhere in the middle. Strangely enough, my truck didn't jolt as if it had collided with something substantial. While the impact sounded definite, there was no corresponding blow through my truck. Heart hammering against my ribs, I skidded to a halt. I fumbled for a flashlight in my console and jumped out. The beam pierced the darkness, cutting through the night as I searched for the figure I was sure I'd hit. I scanned back and forth along the road, but there was nothing. Down the hillside, the beam of my light stretched, searching for anything. A person? An animal? I didn't know what in the hell I was looking for, but there was nothing. No blood, no body, nothing. For a moment it was silent, only the sound of my own voice calling out, and the muted idling of my truck in the distance. But then, slowly, a terrifying moaning sound began to emerge from the drop-off below. It was faint at first, then it grew louder and louder. It was deep, and seemed to be filled with both pain and rage. It was unlike any sound I'd ever heard, and it terrified me to my core. I didn't know what to do. Fear had its icy grip on me, and I quickly found myself back in my truck, hands shaking as I drove down the rest of the mountain and into the closest town. I had to tell someone, had to do something. In an empty parking lot, I called the police and waited. I was a nervous wreck from all of the events that had just transpired. When they finally arrived, I detailed everything to them. Unsurprisingly, I was met with skeptical looks. A light with a silhouette inside it? Appearing in the middle of the road out of nowhere? It didn't look like they were buying it. It didn't help either that there was nothing to show on the front of my truck. No dent, no blood, no hair, nothing. Not even a scratch. None of it made sense to them, and to be honest, None of it made sense to me either. Nevertheless, they had a duty to check it out. I hopped into one of their cars and rode with them back to the spot, pointing out where it had happened. They searched the area, their flashlights bobbing through the night. There was an area on the drop-off where the dirt and leaves looked disturbed, as if something large had been thrashing around. But there was no blood, no body, no sounds, and no evidence of anything that could explain what I had heard and seen. They told me it was probably just exhaustion, that the mountain can play tricks on you at night. They didn't believe me. But how could I blame them? I wouldn't have believed it either if it hadn't happened to me. I think about it all the time. It haunts me. I try to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down inside, I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. I still frequent that road. Duty calls for it. But every time I pass that spot, a chill runs down my spine, and I can't help but wonder what I encountered on that dark mountain road. Story 3. An urban legend comes to life. One night, I found myself on an unfamiliar road. At the time, I didn't know it, but it was a road steeped with urban legend stories. It was said that breaking an unspoken rule on this road could have consequences more terrifying than death itself. I was just coming back from a friend's house. It was a friend I hadn't seen in years, and this was my first trip to visit him in his new home. We talked and laughed and reminisced about old high school stories and girlfriends. It was like taking a trip into the past, and it was a much-needed break from the stress of everyday life. As the sun began to set, I said my goodbyes and promised to catch back up with my old friend sooner rather than later. The drive home was dark and lonely, and took me down roads I had never traveled. As I was making my way down a particularly long stretch of asphalt, I noticed something in the distance. As it got closer and closer, I could see that it was a car coming from the opposite direction with its headlights off. Feeling an obligation to alert the other driver, I flashed my high beams, hoping they'd realize their mistake. I guess I didn't expect anything more than to see the car's headlights flicker on, but instead, I got much more than I bargained for. In my rearview mirror, I could see the car's brake lights come on as the car came to a screeching halt. As if suddenly possessed, it cut a U-turn and kicked up its pace, charging forward with a kind of urgency that seemed almost predatory. Those headlights, once off and harmless, now blazed into action, slicing through the night with an intensity that felt like bright lasers marking its target. The calm, quiet night air was gone, and in its place was the loud, racing thump of my heart. With each beat, a wave of unease washed over me. I held onto the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles going pale, as I made my way along the serpentine road. Behind me, the relentless glare of those headlights bore down, not just following, but hunting. I stepped on the gas, trying to put some distance between me and this mysterious pursuer. But it kept up, its engine roaring like some kind of night creature. When it finally passed me, it did so with a burst of speed, then slowed down, almost like it was mocking me. As it slowed, I slowed down too. Then, without any warning, it stopped dead in the middle of the road. I slammed on my brakes, stopping just in time. The car sat there, silent and unmoving. Panic set in, and I threw my car into reverse, trying to get away. I turned my car around and floored it, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, the car's headlights were on again, following me once more. I drove as fast as I could, the road twisting and turning in front of me. The ghostly car stuck to me like glue. I had no idea why it was chasing me, or what I had done to deserve this. The road seemed to go on forever, and there was nothing that I could do to get away from this mysterious person. But then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the headlights disappeared. And just like that, the car was gone. I constantly checked my rearview mirror for any signs of the car, and when I felt safe enough, I took a different route and didn't stop driving until I was safely in my driveway, under the comforting light of my porch. After that night, I told my story to anyone who would listen. Some people believed me, while others were skeptical. High school kids up to no good, some would say. Whatever the case may be, I never found out, and I never drove that road at night again. I learned my lesson that night, and never flash other drivers anymore, especially if they have their headlights off. You never know who's behind the other wheel or what their intentions may be.